The wind was still carrying dust across the empty stretch of land where the operation had taken place only hours earlier. The sky was turning pale, as if the night was slowly giving up its hold. In the middle of the quiet aftermath, a wounded Navy SEAL lay motionless on a stretcher. His breathing shallow but steady. His gear was torn, his face marked by exhaustion, and his body showed clear signs of a mission that had pushed him far beyond his limits. He had been part of a high-risk operation that did not go as planned. Things had changed quickly in the field, forcing the team to make decisions under pressure. In the confusion that followed, he had taken the hardest hit. By the time help arrived, he was barely conscious, holding on to fading awareness in short, broken moments. Beside him, refusing to leave even when others tried to guide it away, was his military K-9 partner. The dog stayed close, its posture tense, eyes locked on the man it had worked beside for years. It did not bark or panic. Instead, it watched carefully, as if waiting for a command that never came. Every time someone tried to move the stretcher, the dog stepped closer again, blocking the space with quiet determination. The rescue team worked quickly. Communication was brief and focused, as trained professionals moved with practiced urgency. The SEAL was carefully secured for transport. A helicopter was already waiting nearby, its blades cutting through the air with a heavy, rhythmic sound. The situation was critical but controlled. Everyone understood that time mattered more than anything else now. As the stretcher was lifted, the K-9 jumped onto the edge of the platform without hesitation. No one stopped it. In situations like this, the bond between a handler and a military dog was not something easily broken or questioned. It was understood without explanation. The dog stayed low, its body pressed close to the SEAL's side, as if refusing to accept any distance between them. Inside the helicopter, the noise was overwhelming. The engine roared, the wind shook the frame, and the atmosphere was tight with urgency. Medical personnel worked immediately, checking vital signs and stabilizing what they could. The SEAL's condition was fragile, but not beyond hope. His breathing was weak, but consistent enough to give the team something to work with. The K-9 remained still throughout the flight, watching every movement around its handler. It did not react to the noise or the chaos. Its focus never left the SEAL's face. Occasionally, it would shift slightly, pressing closer as if sensing every small change in his condition. One of the medics noticed this but said nothing. There was no need. Everyone on board understood the depth of that connection. The flight felt longer than it actually was. Every second carried weight. The SEAL drifted in and out of awareness, unable to fully open his eyes, but sometimes reacting faintly to voices around him. At one point, his fingers moved slightly, as if searching for something familiar. The K-9 responded instantly, lifting its head and leaning closer. When they finally reached the medical facility, the transition was swift. The doors opened, and a team was already waiting. The stretcher was guided through clean white hallways filled with sharp lighting and controlled movement. The atmosphere shifted from field urgency to hospital precision, but the tension remained the same. The K-9 was allowed to stay close during transfer, something not often granted but respected in special military cases. It walked beside the stretcher without hesitation, matching every step. People along the hallway paused briefly, noticing the unusual presence of the dog and the seriousness of the situation. Inside the emergency area, the SEAL was immediately taken for evaluation. Machines were connected. Monitoring began. Voices stayed low but direct. The medical team worked with focus, trying to stabilize him fully. His condition was serious but not completely critical. There was still a chance for recovery, though it would take time. Through it all, the K-9 stayed near the entrance of the treatment area. It was not allowed inside the full procedure space, but it refused to move far. Every time someone passed through the doors, it would stand slightly, watching for any sign of its handler. When the doors closed, it would sit again, patient but alert. A nurse stood nearby, observing the situation carefully. There was something unusual about the dog's behavior. It was not just loyalty or training. It felt deeper, almost like recognition mixed with caution. Whenever she approached the area, the dog's attention shifted immediately toward her. It did not growl or show aggression, but its posture changed, becoming more protective. Inside the treatment room, the seal's condition remained unstable but manageable. He was unconscious most of the time, drifting between darkness and brief flashes of awareness. His mind was fragmented, filled with pieces of memory that did not connect yet. Sounds reached him in distant waves, but nothing stayed long enough to form clarity. At one moment his eyes slowly opened. The room around him was bright and unfamiliar, filled with movement and quiet urgency. He struggled to focus, blinking slowly as if trying to understand where he was. His breathing changed slightly, and a nearby monitor responded with a soft, steady beep. A nurse moved closer, checking his condition. She spoke calmly, her voice steady and controlled, trying to ground him. The SEAL turned his head slightly toward her. There was confusion in his expression, as if something about her presence triggered a distant memory he could not fully reach. With effort, he whispered, "Do I know you?" The question was faint, almost lost in the sound of machines around him. The nurse paused for a brief moment, surprised but composed. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she continued her work, adjusting what was needed, maintaining professional focus while something unspoken lingered in the air. Outside the room, the K9 suddenly reacted. It stood up sharply, ears forward, body tense. Its gaze fixed on the closed doors, as if it had heard or sensed something important. One of the staff members noticed the change and stepped slightly back. The dog did not move aggressively, but it was clearly alert in a way it had not been before. Moments later, when the nurse stepped out briefly, the K9's attention immediately shifted toward her. It did not bark or lunge, but it followed her every movement with intense focus. As she walked down the hallway, the dog remained still, watching until she disappeared from sight. Inside the room, the SEAL drifted back into unconsciousness. His question remained unanswered, but it stayed in the air like a quiet echo. The medical team continued their work, focused on stabilizing his condition and ensuring he remained safe. As the hours passed, the situation slowly became more stable. The immediate danger was under control, but the deeper uncertainty remained. Who was he remembering? Why had the dog reacted so strongly? And why did that nurse seem connected to something just beyond reach? No one had answers yet. But in that quiet hospital space, something unseen had already begun to shift, waiting for the next moment to reveal itself. Morning light filtered through the hospital windows, soft and pale, as the emergency unit slowly shifted into a steady rhythm. The chaos of the night had settled, but the tension had not disappeared. In one of the critical care rooms, the wounded Navy SEAL remained under close observation. Machines continued their quiet work, tracking every small change in his condition. His breathing was more stable now, but his mind was still lost in a place between awareness and sleep. The K9 was still nearby, sitting just outside the restricted care area. It had not eaten, had not rested, and barely responded to anyone who tried to guide it away. Its focus remained locked on the closed door, as if waiting for it to open at any moment. Every few minutes, it would shift its position slightly, ears turning toward any sound that came from inside. It was not restless in the usual sense. It was waiting with purpose. Inside the room, the SEAL began to show small signs of waking again. His fingers moved first, then a slow change in his breathing pattern followed. A nurse noticed immediately and moved closer, checking the monitors. His eyes fluttered open, struggling to adjust to the brightness. For a few seconds, he stared at the ceiling without recognition, as if trying to place where he was. Then his head turned slightly. The nurse was standing near his right side, adjusting in 4-line. Something about her presence seemed to catch his attention again. His expression tightened slightly, not in fear, but in confusion mixed with recognition that did not fully form. His lips moved before any sound came out. "Do I know you?" he asked again, weaker than before. The nurse paused, her hands still for a moment. She looked at him carefully, as if searching for a response that would not disturb his fragile state. She gave a small, professional nod but did not answer directly. Instead, she continued her work gently, keeping her voice calm and steady as she told him he was safe and in recovery. Outside the room, the K9 suddenly stood up again. This time, its reaction was stronger. A passing staff member tried to guide it back, but it resisted without aggression. It simply refused to move. Its eyes stayed fixed on the nurse whenever she stepped out for supplies or brief updates. The behavior was becoming harder to ignore. One of the attending doctors noticed it and spoke quietly to a colleague. There was something unusual in the dog's focus, almost as if it recognized a connection no one else could see. Military dogs were trained for loyalty and response, but this felt different. This was not routine behavior. It was emotional recognition, something deeper than command training. The nurse herself began to feel it too, though she tried not to show it. Every time she passed the K9, it watched her closely. Not in a threatening way, but with an intensity that made her pause for half a second before continuing. She could not explain why, but there was a strange familiarity in the way it looked at her, as if it was trying to place her in a memory it could not fully retrieve. Inside the room, the seal drifted in and out of awareness again. His mind was still fractured, but fragments of memory were starting to surface more frequently. He saw flashes of movement, blurred faces, and distant sounds. At one point, he frowned slightly, as if something painful or important had touched the edge of his thoughts. The monitors recorded a small spike in his heart rate, then a return to normal. The nurse adjusted his medication carefully and spoke softly to him, reminding him to stay calm and rest. Her voice seemed to have a stabilizing effect. His breathing slowed slightly when she spoke, and his body relaxed just a little. It was subtle but noticeable enough for the team to observe. Outside, the K9 finally moved closer to the door of the room. It did not enter, but it positioned itself directly in front of it, sitting down firmly as if taking guard duty. No one tried to move it after that. There was a quiet understanding among the staff that it was better to allow it to stay where it felt closest to its handler. Later that afternoon, during a routine check, the nurse stepped out of the room briefly. The K9 immediately turned its head toward her. She stopped without thinking, meeting its gaze for a moment. There was no sound between them, but something passed in that silence. She could not explain it, but it made her feel unsettled in a quiet way. One of the other nurses approached her afterward and mentioned the dog's behavior. They spoke in low voices, careful not to disturb the environment. It was unusual for a military K9 to respond so strongly to someone outside its handler, especially in a medical setting where multiple staff members came and went constantly. The nurse simply listened, then nodded slightly, saying she had noticed it too. She did not elaborate further. There was something she could not yet put into words, a feeling that the situation was tied to something beyond the present moment. Back in the room, the seal's condition continued to stabilize slowly. He was still not fully conscious, but he was more responsive than before. When voices spoke near him, he sometimes turned his head slightly. When the nurse checked his vitals, he followed her movement faintly with his eyes, even if he did not fully focus. At one point, he whispered something again, too soft for most to hear clearly. The nurse leaned in slightly but did not press him to repeat it. She simply noted it and continued her care. His expression softened afterward, as if the act of speaking had eased something within him. The K9 outside shifted its position again, standing briefly before sitting back down. It remained calm, but alert, as if guarding not just the physical space but something deeper. A few staff members exchanged quiet looks, acknowledging that whatever connection was forming here was not random. As evening approached, the hospital lights became warmer and the pace of movement slowed slightly. The seal remained under close monitoring, his condition steady but still fragile. The nurse completed her final checks for the shift, but before leaving, she paused for a moment at the doorway. The K9 looked at her again. This time, there was something different in its gaze. Less tension, more recognition mixed with uncertainty. She hesitated for a second, then continued walking, but the feeling stayed with her. Inside the room, the seal's eyes opened one more time before the end of the shift. He did not speak this time. He simply looked toward the door, then toward the nurse, as if trying to connect pieces that refused to come together. And just before darkness pulled him back under, there was a faint sense that something from the past was beginning to surface, slowly, like a memory trying to find its way back into the present. The hospital had settled into a quieter rhythm as night returned. The bright intensity of the emergency hours had softened into something steadier, but the atmosphere around the SEALs room still carried a weight that did not ease. Machines continued their steady monitoring, and the soft hum of medical equipment filled the background like a constant reminder that his condition was still delicate. He lay still most of the time, drifting in and out of sleep. Each time he surfaced, it was only for a few seconds before slipping back under again. His body was recovering slowly, but his mind remained scattered. Fragments of thoughts came and went without forming a complete picture. Faces, sounds, and places appeared briefly, then disappeared before he could hold on to them. Outside the room, the K9 had not moved far from its position all day. It had become a quiet presence in the hallway, sitting close to the door as if assigned to guard it permanently. Staff had tried again to relocate it to a more comfortable area, but every attempt had failed. It would stand briefly, take a few steps, then return to the same spot near the entrance. Eventually, they stopped insisting. It was easier to allow it to stay. The nurse from earlier shifts returned for her evening round. Her steps were calm, controlled, but there was something thoughtful in her expression. She had been trying not to read too much into what had been happening, but it was becoming harder to dismiss. The SEAL's reaction to her, and the dog's unusual behavior, felt like pieces of a story she did not yet understand. As she approached the room, the K9 immediately lifted its head. It watched her closely as she came closer. She slowed slightly, meeting its gaze for a brief moment. There was no hostility, only focus. The kind of focus that felt almost familiar, though she could not explain why. She entered the room quietly. The SEAL was asleep at first, his breathing slow and steady. She checked his readings and adjusted a few settings, moving with practiced care. The room was dimmer now, the lighting softened for rest. Everything felt calm on the surface, but beneath it, there was still tension waiting to surface. As she finished her checks, she noticed a change in his breathing pattern. It shifted slightly, indicating he was waking again. She paused, watching carefully. His eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. This time, his awareness returned more clearly than before. He did not immediately speak. Instead, he looked around the room as if trying to confirm what he was seeing. Then his eyes stopped on her. There was a longer pause this time. Not confusion alone, but something deeper. His expression tightened slightly, as if a distant memory was pressing against the surface of his thoughts. His lips parted, but no words came out at first. The nurse waited calmly, not pushing him. She had learned that rushing him only made him drift back into confusion faster. Instead, she stayed still, letting him find his own way. After a moment, he finally spoke, though his voice was weak. "It feels like, I've seen you before." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The nurse did not respond immediately. She continued to monitor his condition, keeping her tone steady when she finally spoke. "You're in a hospital. You were injured, but you're safe now." He nodded slightly, but his eyes did not leave her face. There was something unsettled in his expression, like a missing piece he was trying to place. His gaze softened, then shifted slightly as if he was hearing something else in the background. Outside the room, the K9 suddenly became alert again. It stood up slowly, its posture changing in a way that immediately drew attention. One of the nearby staff members noticed and stepped closer, but the dog did not react aggressively. It simply focused on the door, ears forward, body still. Inside, the SEAL turned his head slightly toward the hallway, as if he could sense the same shift. His breathing became uneven for a moment. The nurse noticed the change and checked his monitor, then gently placed a hand near his shoulder to steady him. "It's okay," she said quietly. "You're just remembering things. It will come back slowly." But something in his expression suggested it was already coming back faster than expected. His eyes closed briefly, then reopened. This time, a sharper fragment of memory surfaced. Not clear, not complete, but stronger than before. He saw movement, a mission environment, the sound of distant commands, and something else, a presence beside him that felt familiar in a way he could not explain. His breathing quickened slightly. The nurse adjusted his oxygen levels, watching him carefully. "Try to stay with me," she said softly. He focused again, slowly calming. But now there was a change. He was no longer completely lost in confusion. Something had begun to connect inside him, even if only in broken pieces. Outside the room, the K9 had moved closer to the door. It stood directly in front of it again, but this time it was more tense. Not aggressive, but protective in a heightened way. It let out a low sound, almost like a warning or recognition. Staff nearby exchanged uncertain looks, unsure how to interpret it. The nurse stepped out briefly to speak with a colleague. As she exited, the dog's attention immediately followed her. It did not move, but its gaze tracked her every step down the hallway. She noticed it again, and for a moment, she stopped. There was something about the intensity that felt like recognition, but not from the present. She continued walking, though more slowly this time. Inside the room, the seal remained awake longer than before. His focus drifted between the ceiling and the space where the nurse had been standing. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. There was a mission. I can't remember all of it, but there was someone there. His words were fragmented, but they were clearer than anything he had said before. The nurse listened carefully, not interrupting. He frowned slightly, struggling to bring the memory forward. "There was a dog," he added after a moment. "Always close, always watching." At that exact moment, outside the room, the K9 shifted its position again, sitting down more firmly, as if confirming something. The nurse returned and heard the last part of his sentence. She paused for a second before stepping back inside. Something about the timing unsettled her, though she did not show it. The seal turned his head slightly toward her again. "And someone else," he continued slowly. "A woman, I think." The room became quieter in that moment. Even the sound of the machines seemed less noticeable. The nurse did not respond right away. Instead, she checked his vitals again, keeping her hands steady. But inside her mind, something was beginning to align in a way she could not ignore. The seal closed his eyes again, not because he was losing consciousness, but because the effort of remembering was exhausting him. His breathing slowed as he drifted back into rest. Outside, the K9 finally lay down again, but its eyes remained open. And for the first time since his arrival at the hospital, there was a sense that something buried in the past was no longer staying hidden. The night had grown deeper, and the hospital felt quieter than before. Most of the usual movement in the corridors had slowed, leaving only the soft footsteps of staff on routine rounds and the distant sound of machines keeping watch over patients. In the critical care wing, the atmosphere around the SEAL's room remained steady, but there was a subtle change in energy that even the experienced staff could feel. He was still resting, but no longer in the same deep, disconnected state as earlier. His recovery had shifted into a more fragile awareness. He would drift into sleep, then return briefly, as if his mind was testing how much of reality it could hold at once. Each time he woke, his eyes seemed clearer, but also more troubled, as though something inside him was slowly rising to the surface. The nurse continued her checks with calm precision. She had been assigned longer observation hours than usual, partly because of the instability of his memory responses and partly because of the unusual behavior surrounding him. She did not complain. Instead, she focused on her work, but her thoughts were no longer entirely professional. There was something personal beginning to form in her understanding of this situation, even if she could not yet explain why. Outside the room, the K9 remained in its familiar position. It had barely moved for hours except to shift its weight or adjust its posture. Its attention was fixed on the door, but not in a restless way. Felt more like vigilance mixed with expectation, as if it believed something important was still behind that door, waiting to be understood. The nurse stepped out briefly to review some notes with a colleague. As she walked into the hallway, the dog immediately lifted its head again. The reaction had become predictable now, but no less striking. Every movement she made drew its attention. It did not follow her physically, but it watched her as if she carried something it recognized but could not fully recall. Her colleague noticed the pattern too and quietly mentioned it. There was a sense of curiosity in the discussion, but also caution. Military working dogs were trained to respond to command structure, not emotional memory. Yet this one behaved differently. It responded to her in a way that felt less like training and more like recognition. The nurse did not offer much explanation. She simply nodded, then returned to the room. Inside, the seal was awake again. This time he was more stable. His breathing was steady, and his gaze was less scattered. When she entered, he turned his head slowly toward her without hesitation. There was still confusion in his eyes, but it was now layered with something else. A sense of familiarity that was growing stronger each time. "You're here again," he said quietly. She gave a small, calm response, adjusting the equipment beside him. "I've been here most of the time," she replied gently. "You've been resting and recovering." He studied her for a moment. Then his expression shifted slightly, as if something had clicked deeper in his memory. "It's not just this place," he said slowly. "It feels like I've known you longer than this." The nurse paused briefly, but continued working. She had heard similar fragments before, but this time they felt more grounded, less like confusion and more like emerging clarity. Outside the room, the K9 suddenly stood up. Its movement was sharper than before. Paced once, then stopped directly facing the door again. One of the nearby staff members noticed the shift and instinctively stepped closer, but the dog did not react aggressively. Instead, it let out a low, controlled sound, almost like a signal. The nurse noticed the change when she stepped out again. The dog's behavior was becoming more defined. It was no longer just reacting to her presence. It was reacting to something connected to her presence and the patient inside. She stopped for a moment, looking at the dog. It looked back at her without blinking. In that stillness, there was a strange sense of communication, though nothing was spoken. Then she continued walking, but slower than before. Inside the room, the seal's condition remained stable. But his memory was no longer fragmented in the same way. It was beginning to form short, connected sequences. Not full memories yet, but enough to create emotional reactions. He closed his eyes briefly, then spoke again. "There was training. Different place. Not here." He paused, trying to organize the thought. "And there was someone who stayed behind when others left." His voice grew quieter, but more focused. "I remember a dog. It never left my side." The nurse listened carefully, noting his responses. But there was something about his tone that made the room feel heavier. Not in a negative way, but in a way that suggested truth was beginning to surface. Outside, the K9 had settled again, but its posture was different now. Less tense, more alert in a focused way. It was no longer pacing or shifting frequently. It had become still, almost as if it was listening. The nurse returned to the room and continued her checks. As she adjusted the monitor, the seal suddenly turned his head slightly more toward her than before. "And you," he said slowly, "you were there too." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The nurse did not respond immediately. Instead, she checked his vitals again, giving herself a moment. But her expression changed slightly, just enough for someone observant to notice. There was recognition in his voice that she could not dismiss as coincidence anymore. "You're remembering fragments," she said carefully. "It's normal after trauma. Your mind is trying to rebuild things in pieces." He did not argue. Instead, he seemed to accept that explanation, but his expression suggested something deeper was still forming beneath it. Outside the room, the K9 suddenly shifted again. This time, it moved closer to the door and sat directly facing it. A different staff member approached, but stopped when the dog let out another low, steady sound. It was not aggressive, but it was firm enough to discourage interruption. The nurse noticed this when she stepped out briefly again. She stood still for a moment watching the dog, Something about its behavior felt like confirmation rather than reaction, as if it was witnessing the same memories being rebuilt inside the room. She returned inside. The seal was quieter now. He was not speaking, but his eyes were open, focused on the ceiling. His mind seemed to be working through something internally. The nurse checked his readings and noticed a slight increase in alertness, though still within safe limits. After a long pause, he spoke again, softer this time. "I think there was an event. Something went wrong." He swallowed slightly. "I was injured, but I don't remember all of it." Then his eyes shifted toward her again. "But I remember not being alone." The room fell into a quiet stillness after that. Even the machine sounds felt less intrusive for a moment. Outside, the K9 finally lay down, but it did not relax fully. Its eyes remained open, watching the door without moving. The nurse completed her checks and prepared to leave the room briefly. Before she stepped out, she looked at the seal one more time. His eyes were still open, but calmer now. "Rest," she said gently. "Let your mind recover slowly." He gave a faint nod, but his expression suggested he was still somewhere between memory and reality. As she exited, the K9 immediately turned its gaze toward her again. And this time, the feeling in the air was no longer uncertainty. It was recognition slowly becoming impossible to ignore. Morning light returned to the hospital with a softer tone than the previous days. The tension that had surrounded the critical care wing was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer only about survival. It was about understanding something that was slowly coming back together inside a broken memory. The seal had made progress overnight. His condition was now stable, and he was awake for longer periods without slipping back into confusion. His body was still weak, but his mind had begun to connect fragments that once felt completely separate. Each time he opened his eyes, there was more awareness, more focus, and more recognition in the way he looked at the people around him. The nurse continued her rounds early that morning. She moved with the same calm routine as always, but there was a quiet weight in her thoughts now. The situation had changed how she saw the patient, the dog, and even herself within this space. She no longer viewed it as just a recovery case. It felt like something unfinished was trying to complete itself in front of her. Outside the room, the K9 remained close. It had barely left its position since the night before. It stood when it needed to, sat when it could, but its attention never drifted far from the door. Staff had grown used to its presence now. It was no longer seen as unusual behavior. It was seen as part of the situation itself. When the nurse approached the room, the dog immediately responded as it always did. But this time something was different. Its reaction was not just alertness. It felt almost expectant, as if it knew something important was about to happen. She paused briefly, looking at it. The dog did not move aggressively. It simply watched her with steady focus. There was something in its eyes that felt familiar in a way she could not explain. Not recognition of her as a person, but recognition of something connected to her presence. She entered the room. The seal was awake already. This time he was sitting slightly propped up, supported by pillows. His movements were slow, but controlled. He turned his head toward her immediately when she entered, without hesitation. For a few seconds he just looked at her. There was no confusion now, only focus. "You're still here," he said. It was not a question. It was more like a realization. The nurse nodded gently. "I've been part of your care team," she replied. He studied her face carefully, as if trying to confirm something that had been building in his mind for days. "I remember more now," he said slowly. She did not interrupt. She simply adjusted a monitor beside him, giving him space to continue. His eyes shifted slightly as he spoke again. "There was a mission. Not everything is clear, but I remember the movement, the noise, the pressure." He paused, as if searching deeper. "And I remember the dog. Always close, always watching." The nurse glanced briefly toward the door, where the K9 was waiting outside. He continued, "It didn't leave my side, even when things went wrong." His voice became quieter. "And there was someone else, a medical unit. Someone who helped when things collapsed. The room grew quieter as he spoke. The machines continued their steady rhythm, but everything else felt still. The nurse listened carefully, her expression steady, though something inside her was beginning to tighten. She had heard fragments before, but now they were forming into a sequence. He looked at her again. "I think it was you," he said simply. There was no dramatic tone, no shock, just a calm certainty forming from broken memory. The nurse paused for a moment longer than usual. She adjusted the equipment again, giving herself a brief delay before responding. "You're still recovering your memory," she said carefully. Sometimes the mind connects people incorrectly during recovery. But even as she said it, her tone was softer than before. He did not argue. Instead, he looked away for a moment, as if replaying something internally. Outside, the K9 suddenly stood up. This time, the movement was not sharp or tense. It felt purposeful. It walked closer to the door and stopped directly in front of it. One of the staff members nearby watched quietly but did not intervene. The nurse noticed it when she stepped out for a brief update. The dog was no longer just reacting. It was waiting. She stood for a moment, looking at it. The feeling she had been avoiding for days was now impossible to ignore. There was a connection here not just between handler and dog, but between memory and recognition that had not yet fully surfaced. She returned to the room. The seal was looking at the ceiling now, but he spoke as soon as she entered. "I remember voices," he said slowly. "Command signals, confusion, then silence." He paused. "And then I remember being carried." His gaze shifted toward her again. "Someone stayed with me when the others moved out." The nurse remained quiet, letting him continue. His breathing steadied as he spoke. "I think I was fading in and out. I don't remember everything clearly, but I remember not being alone." He turned his head slightly toward the door. "And I remember the dog refusing to leave." At that exact moment, outside the room, the K9 let out a low sound. Not loud, not aggressive. It was steady, almost like acknowledgement. The nurse's attention shifted briefly toward the sound. When she looked back at the seal, she saw something new in his expression. Clarity. Not complete memory, but enough to form connection. "There was a collapse during the mission," he said slowly. "I was injured badly. I think I lost awareness for a while." He closed his eyes briefly, then reopened them. "When I woke up, I wasn't where I was supposed to be." He looked at her directly again. "And I think you were part of getting me out." The nurse's hands paused for a fraction of a second. She quickly resumed her work, but her expression had changed slightly. There was recognition in his words that could not be fully dismissed anymore. She spoke softly. "If I was part of your medical evacuation, then I would have been one of many on the team. You may be remembering the support staff together." He nodded slightly, but did not fully accept or reject the explanation. Instead, he seemed to settle into a quiet understanding that more pieces were still missing. Outside, the K9 had not moved. It was still positioned at the door, watching. The nurse completed her checks, then prepared to step out again. Before she did, the seal spoke one last time. "I don't think this is all just memory confusion," he said quietly. She stopped briefly but did not turn fully. He continued, "There's something I'm still not seeing clearly." A pause. "And I think the dog knows it too." The nurse looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded slightly and stepped out. The K9 immediately shifted its gaze toward her again. But this time it was not just watching. It was waiting for the truth to finally surface.